terms of predictions, the lips are sealed.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Elias Game Plan. I'm Jimmy Wright from the Elias Sports Bureau, and today I am virtually sitting down with Rob Diamond, who is the head of Knight Research. Rob, thanks so much for doing this.
Hey Jimmy, good to be here.
Right, so obviously NBA Finals are kicking off this week, so I figured we would sit down and talk some hoops. So you're the head of Knight Research. As I mentioned, I know that you work very closely with the research team from the NBA and obviously many other of Elias's media clients. So the first question I had was, what would you say has been the main storyline for these NBA playoffs as we head into the finals?
Yeah, there's basically been two underlying themes, one positive, one maybe not so much. The youth movement is very much underway in the NBA with new stars breaking through. All 5 members of the All-NBA first team this season were 27 years old or younger, and that's the first time it's happened since 1954-55 season.
Jeez.
So many familiar names to NBA fans who are on the wrong side of 30, guys like LeBron James, Damian Lillard, Russell Westbrook. They failed to even qualify for the playoffs this year. They missed a lot of time with injury, and just the Lakers were just not too good. Other guys like Kevin Durant, Chris Paul, James Harden, teams with a lot of helium. They got a lot of media coverage going into the playoffs. They were dispatched pretty soundly in the early rounds. So the young stars, players like Luka Doncic and John Morant, have made the leap on the big stage of the playoffs, putting up huge stat lines with Doncic only 23 years old, Morant only 22. It's all the more impressive. The old guys aren't dead and buried yet. Just look at the Western Conference champions as proof. But a postseason without LeBron James still provided plenty of highlights. So the high quality of play, as well plenty of injuries to key players, have led to a lot of blowouts as well. That's been kind of the other main story of this postseason. And that's there have been 22 games decided by 20 points going into the finals. And that's only the second time in NBA playoff history there's been as many as 20 games decided by 20 points in a single postseason. And more than half the games of this year's playoffs, 50 games, a team that was behind at halftime never went ahead in the second half. So they trailed the entire second way. Wow. So the games haven't exactly been competitive either. That being said, the Warriors have overcome a double-digit deficit in half of their 12 wins so far. So I'm optimistic these last two teams, the Warriors and Celtics, can provide a little more close scoring affairs.
Yeah, hopefully. It's never fun when the game is essentially over at halftime.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the Warriors. You mentioned a bit of a changing of the guard, and that's interesting because the Warriors, we saw a bit of a dynasty a few years ago, but it's easy to forget that 2 years ago they posted the worst record in the league.
That's right.
So we went from a Steve Kerr dynasty to absolute bottom of the barrel, and just 3 seasons later, they are back to the finals. So how does a team pull that off?
Well, COVID kind of made everything a little screwy, didn't it? But the season began for the Warriors with great difficulty. Kevin Durant went to Brooklyn. The Warriors got D'Angelo Russell out of it. But then Klay Thompson also tore his ACL in the finals and was due to miss the entire season. Right. And then Stephen Curry goes down. So he only played 5 games in the 2019-2020 season. So all of their money was lined up in these guys that were just never taking the court. So they never really had a chance. Right. But they started planting their seeds in that season. So they picked up Russell, saw that he wasn't going to work out alongside Steph Curry and Klay Thompson because he needs the ball to succeed. He's not an off-the-ball kind of player. Mm-hmm. They trade Russell to Minnesota for Wiggins, who was not the guy he is this season. He was still kind of an unfinished product. He was kind of considered a bust as a number one pick.
Bit of not living up to what he should have been by that point.
Exactly, yeah. So they even and Golden State even got a number 1 pick out of Minnesota for it, which they used to draft Jonathan Kuminga this past year. So in terms of just the roster was, I think they took it as kind of like a buffer year. So they realized they weren't going to compete with all of the star talent on the sidelines. So they tried to develop their young guys and figure out which players were going to be on the next winning team. So this year, since then, they signed Kelly Oubre. That didn't work out. They sent him packing. They signed Otto Porter Jr. this season for the veterans minimum, and this is a guy who had made like $20 million a year with the Washington Wizards. But unbelievably, if you had to guess which player had the greatest impact in this year's playoffs, Otto Porter Jr., believe it or not, is at the top of the list in terms of net rating. The Warriors have scored 15 points per 100 possessions more than they've allowed. And that leads not just Warriors players, it leads all players. Otto Porter Jr. has had the single greatest impact in this year's playoffs.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't believe it, but
the numbers don't lie. I wouldn't have believed it until I saw it.
Yep. Yeah, I knew you'd have something to back up your statement, Rob.
Not only were they concerned about the depth of the roster, but they also re-signed Klay Thompson, who was injured, for the maximum, which was considered a huge risk at the time. They re-signed Draymond Green, who could have taken more money with another team, but they gave him $100 million for 4 years. That has turned out well. So there's something to be said about team chemistry, especially in the playoffs, and especially when the pecking order has been kind of established, where everyone knows their place and their role. Coach Steve Kerr has preached team over individual, and with this group of players, it's really evident that that's sunk in. Curry's the number one option. Draymond Green leads the defense. Klay Thompson is a wild card, and everyone else pitches in their role, and it's really worked for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talked about almost a hard reset that this team had to go through to climb out of the basement and to now make it back to the finals. But, you're talking Steph Curry, you're talking Klay Thompson. These are guys that all the fans remember from those title runs a few years ago. When I think of those teams, when I think of certainly Curry and Thompson, the Splash Brothers, right? They were hitting threes, at will. They're not really quite that team anymore, though, are they, Rob?
Steph Curry is not pulling up from midcourt anymore. There's no logo threes this year. It's a little surprising that Boston has actually made and attempted more three-pointers in this year's playoffs than Golden State has.
Wow.
But then you go to the scoring leaders, and look who's number one. It's Golden State Warriors. And the way they're doing it in this year's playoffs is the strength of the two-pointers. They are shooting 57% on two-point attempts, which is number one in the league. They're shooting 72% on shots from less than 5 feet from the hoop. So they're getting to, then that includes Steph Curry's driving in, Andrew Wiggins is getting to the hoop. Boston is shooting, and that, just to put that in a little bit of context, 72% from 5 feet away sounds, is that good? Is that great? I mean, you're so close. Consider the Boston is shooting closer to 60%. So Golden State at 72%. You can see his head and shoulders above. Wiggins is attempting 6 shots per game in the playoffs from less than 10 feet from the rim. Curry and Jordan Poole are attempting 5 shots from that distance. Draymond Green and Kevon Looney are attempting 4 shots a game from that distance. And those numbers were even higher against Dallas, who couldn't keep Golden State out of the lane. So they just kept driving and driving. They saw what was going to work, and they kept hitting it. So Boston,
I think the Warriors sort of ushered in this 3-point, revolution. And now as everyone's doing it, and you hear people say that the NBA players want to do nothing but shoot threes, now you're telling us that the Warriors are at the forefront of maybe not jacking up so many threes and instead playing, sort of not an old school style, but a little closer to what people might expect even a few years ago of, getting to the basket a little more.
That's right. It's all about efficiency, really. So with the increase of 3-point shots, it's about getting the most points per possession. That's what you're really looking for. So nowadays, teams are averaging about 1.1 to 1.2, 1.25 points per possession. And the best way to get that, if you're shooting 40% on 3-pointers, there you go. You're already above the threshold. So that's why a lot of teams are shooting a lot of 3-pointers. And then if you want to meet that threshold, you can get in the paint and shoot from close distance. The closer you are to the hoop, the more shots you're likely to make.
Yep.
So that the kind of mid area is the mid range shot is what you kind of try to avoid. But even that has become, the good players like Chris Paul, like Steph Curry, and like Andrew Wiggins, they can make that 15-footer just as well. If they can shoot 55, 60% on those kinds of shots, there's no reason they should not be taking those shots.
Sure, right. That's interesting. That's a really nice way to sort of catalog the evolution they've made under Steve Kerr. Really a testament to the coaching job Steve Kerr has done with that team.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just saw Mike Brown got hired by Sacramento, so this will be his curtain call.
Right.
The entire coaching staff really deserves a lot of credit for keeping. They had the same core, really, with Curry, Thompson, Draymond Green. You can include Andre Iguodala in there.
Yep.
It's not guys like the quartet does not stay together that long and maintain their focus to get titles like over this stretch. I mean, like the Jordan Bulls, they had 3 guys, but like a set of 4 guys, they just don't stay together this long usually, especially in the free agency era where team players are just going for the big contracts.
Right.
This is really an exception.
Yeah. So I think we covered the Warriors really well. Now let's check in on their opponents, the Celtics. So this is the first time since 2010 Boston has made the NBA Finals. And I ask you, Rob, was this inevitable that the Celtics were going to end up here?
It's inevitable. It's pretty much it was the opposite of inevitable. So they opened their season with a loss to the New York Knicks. And I mean, come on.
Not a great start.
Losing to the Knicks that'll leave a sour taste in your mouth. And 2 days later, they lose their home opener by 32. And I mean, incredible. It was to Toronto, who was a good team, but they had more losses than wins at the season's halfway point. They were 20-21. And you know how many teams have done that, by the way? How many teams have advanced to the finals with a losing record at least 40 games into the season?
I gotta think it's under 10.
It's Boston's the 7th team in 76 NBA seasons, the first since Houston in 1980-81 to advance to the finals with a losing record more than halfway through the season. None of the previous 6 have won, so that's food for thought for Boston.
There we go.
But they couldn't put more than 3 wins together, more than a 3-game winning streak until February. But all the while, Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum were going to the press. They're saying the right things. Marcus Smart was preaching patience in the early days of the season because it may Udoka's first season. They compared it to a new boss coming in and completely changing the way you work when you're used to a certain way of doing things, and it takes time to process all of that. And then what do you know? Smart ended up sounding smart. They won 9 of 10 games right before the All-Star break. They won 13 of 15 immediately after the All-Star break. They went from allowing 138 points in that game to the Knicks. In their final matchup, they allowed 75 to the Knicks.
Man.
So a big, whole big change in the second half. First half of the season, they were middle of the pack in terms of scoring margin. They were outscoring teams by about 1.6 points per game. In the second half of the season, the last 41 games, Boston was outscoring opponents by 6.5 points. So that was best in the league.
Wow.
31 wins. They allowed 103 points per game over that stretch, which was by far the best in the league. They're 3 points better than Dallas, who ranked second. They became a dominant defensive force. They were holding opponents regularly under 100 points. So that just doesn't really happen anymore. And they snuck the number 2 seed away from the Bucks on the last day of the season, which guaranteed home court for the first 2 rounds, and that ended up being a big deal.
Right. So then this team goes through this evolution. They hit their stride at just the right time. They pop the number 2 seed. And what does that mean? I remember those seeding games that everybody was talking about. And what was it? Nobody wanted to play the Nets.
That's right.
Kevin Durant, who just got healthy. You had Kyrie Irving, who is now, going to be playing in home games again. His game restrictions were essentially off.
That's right.
So that's what they get prized with. They get a team that really nobody wanted to play. And
the will he or won't he with Ben Simmons, too, because Simmons was very much in play going into that series. Then no one was sure one way or another. Milwaukee actually could have taken the number 2 seed had they won their season finale, and some might say they might have thrown it on purpose. And the Celtics, though, were very much, even as a 2 seed, they were very much underdogs in the public's eye.
Yeah.
People wanted to see Kevin Durant versus James Harden in the Eastern Conference Finals. The Nets actually opened in some sportsbooks as small favorites, which is rare for a 2 versus 7 matchup.
Wow.
And to Brooklyn's credit, all of their losses were decided by fewer than 8 points, but the Celtics still just swept them aside. The Nets shot better than them, finished with better field goal percentage, better 3-point percentage, but the Celtics prevailed with fundamentals. They out-rebounded, they committed fewer turnovers, and they made more free throws. Sometimes it's just that simple. Make your foul shots. The Nets, they missed 7 free throws in game 2. They lost by 7. They missed 12 free throws in game 4, and they lost by 4. So for what it's worth, Boston finished second in the league this season, 82% free throw rate, and they're making 81% of their free throws in the playoffs. So
sometimes it's the simple things, right? 3 points. You need to actually hit those shots, but that can make all the difference.
That's right. So then after dispatching Brooklyn, they had Milwaukee next, and the defending champions. They had Giannis at full strength. They didn't have Chris Middleton, but they had enough of their core from the previous season that they were absolutely a challenge. And it turns out that home court advantage that Milwaukee ceded on the final day that came into play, because the series did go 7 games, and Boston hosted the deciding game, and they won that game easily. It was just a lot of Jaylen Brown, like the team had truly come together, and they just had more star power than Boston. They had a plan for Giannis, and with Middleton out, they just didn't have a true second option to defend with Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum. So in the Eastern Conference Finals, it's a rematch from the bubble with Miami. And at this point, it's like a revenge tour for Boston, because they're facing the 3 teams that knocked them out of the playoffs in the previous 3 years. Brooklyn, Miami, and Milwaukee had dispatched them from the playoffs in 2019, 2020, 2021. So Miami's the number 1 seed, but Kyle Lowry is hobbling. I mean, he's about playing maybe 70%. Halfway through the season, Tyler Hero goes down, and Jimmy Butler was getting his numbers, but it turned out it wasn't enough. I mean, the Celtics were outscoring the Heat with Butler on the floor. They were outscoring the Heat with Butler off the floor. So they led wire to wire in Game 7, and in doing so, they made Coach Udoka the first rookie coach to win multiple Game 7s. So very impressive feat there.
Wow, that's we cataloged how Steve Kerr has done such a good job there, but obviously Boston's got a pretty smart guy on their sidelines as well. Speaking of who's gotten Boston here, you mentioned Jaylen Brown. We just saw Jayson Tatum win the MVP of the Eastern Conference Finals. So these are 2 guys that Boston drafted back-to-back 2016, 2017. And this is a storied Boston franchise, right? Everyone knows the big names, but these 2 are the 2 who got them to this finals. What maybe sets them apart from some of the legends of this franchise's past?
Well, they've achieved a lot in a short order, and they are still very young. I mean, Brown is 25, Tatum is 24. They've already played 5 seasons together because they came out of college early, and both players are averaging a lot of points at such a young age, and that's just something that didn't happen for all Celtics. Usually with the 80 Celtics, Larry Bird was scoring a lot, but maybe not so much. Kevin McHale kind of chipped in, but it was Bird's show.
Right.
For the Bill Russell Celtics, it was guys like Sam Jones scoring most of the points, with Russell chipping in when he had to. But even so, Russell was in his 30s for a lot of those, for a few of those titles.
Yeah, not really the offensive dynamo of those teams anyway. Bill Russell, you think defense, rebounding, but Brown and Tatum they can really fill the stat sheet.
Yeah, for sure. They're rebounds and assists too. In terms of, and just to have these 2 guys playing together, hitting their primes kind of at the same time. So like they've played over 360 games together, including more than 60 playoff games, and neither player is 26 years old. I mean, that just, it doesn't happen this early, this quickly, to achieve both team success and individual success. They played in 37 wins in the playoffs together. That's the most ever for 2 all-star teammates who are 25 or younger. They've scored 30 or more points in the same game 12 times, more than any duo at any age in Celtics history. Just to focus on Tatum for a second, because he did reach the first team and All NBA team this year. You could just see the gradual improvement in his game year after year. Looking at his season numbers, he's increased his per game averages in points and rebounds and assists from the previous season in each of the four previous seasons. So he's played 5 years in the NBA. Every year, the points per game, rebounds per game, assists per game have gone up. How many times has that happened in Celtics history? No times. Tatum is the first ever in this history of the storied franchise to have 4 consecutive seasons of that kind. Robert Williams III, also on this roster, has had a 3-year streak of that kind, and he's alongside Bill Russell, John Havlicek, and Casey Jones. So we're talking, best of the best of those old Celtics teams. So the fact that Tatum is 1 year ahead of Russell and Havlicek is just, it speaks to how his game has progressed and how he's matured and how just unstoppable he's proven being in every facet of the game.
Yeah, it was, for a few years, like you said, we've been watching Brown and Tatum, and it was almost like who's the alpha dog there, who's better. And not to take anything away from Jaylen Brown, you've chronicled how good he's been, but it seems like this was almost a coming out party for Tatum in these playoffs, and especially like you said, guys like LeBron not in these playoffs, some of the old guard either one and dones like Durant or just not even qualifying. And for a guy like Tatum, he really seemed to seize this stage.
That's right, yeah. And gives a lot of credit to Jaylen Brown too, who could have made this a power struggle. I remember the old teams who, the Kobe Shaq Lakers, who fell apart because one of them wanted to be the alpha dog. They both wanted to be the alpha dog.
Right.
My favorite team growing up were the Timberwolves of Kevin Garnett and Stephon Marbury. And Marbury forced the trade because he couldn't be the number 2 to Kevin Garnett. So that broke up a potentially great team. They were both young, talented, and Marbury wanted to be the number 1, where KG was clearly it. So give credit to Jaylen Brown, who is if he's not quite the number 2, he's the 1B, and he's accepted that if it means that the team's going to the finals and could win a title.
Yeah, that maturation process within the season, you're obviously seeing the fruits of it now.
That's right.
Yeah. So we've covered the Warriors, we've covered the Celtics. How did they do against one another? So we know they played each other. They each beat the other on the other team's home court. So they both went on the road and got tough wins.
That's right.
So in those games, was there anything that stood out that might provide some insights into what a fan can expect from this series?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because the Warriors were not at full strength for either of those games. So Klay Thompson and Jordan Poole both missed the Warriors' win in Boston in December. And then Steph Curry got injured. He played less than 15 minutes in the Celtics win in March after injuring his ankle. Right. And in that game, Andrew Wiggins and Gary Payton II missed that game. So Curry had, in the win in December, Curry, he had an effective field goal percentage of 50%. So his overall field goal percentage looks pretty bad, but considering he made all those 3-pointers, he actually had a good night. He had 30 points. Then again, he also committed 6 turnovers and he fouled out. Klay Thompson had a rough shooting night against Boston's defense. Just Marcus Smart is just the kind of guy who will swallow up you on the perimeter. So there wasn't anything too notable about the March win except that the Celtics won by 22 and Golden State only got to 88 points. It's tough to make a kind of sweeping call on that because, again, the Golden State wasn't quite at full strength. And Al Horford missed the December loss for Boston. So
okay,
this is the first time we're seeing them, both teams, full strength.
All right, so we're at full strength. We know that the Warriors have this is the culmination of reinventing themselves. We know that Boston started pretty lukewarm and are now, on fire as they enter the finals.
Yeah.
I'm not opening my wallet to take your advice, Rob. I think you're a smart guy. I'm not going to go that far. But do you have any sort of inclination or leanings here? How do you expect this series to go?
At Elias, we have to be objective, of course.
Yep.
We have thoughts, but we're not so much rooting
Okay.
for one team or another. I have noticed that the so-called death lineup that Golden State trots out every year. So it used to be with Kevin Durant, where they go small with Andre Iguodala playing center, or who was it? Harrison Barnes playing center in their first title run. So their new death lineup has Kevon Looney playing the middle, or Draymond Green. And that lineup of Curry, Klay Thompson, Andrew Wiggins, Draymond, and Looney have outscored opponents by 17 points per 100 possessions in the playoffs. I mean, that is the true death lineup. Man. So if Steve Kerr goes to that lineup, and he has, because that's their most frequently used in the postseason so far, it's going to be tough goings for Boston, even with Defensive Player of the Year and Marcus Smart and the inside presence of Robert Williams and Grant Williams. It's tough to see how Boston is going to stop that scoring. That being said, a lot of the Warriors' depth is banged up right now. So Otto Porter missed the last couple of games. Gary Payton broke his arm in I think his elbow in the Memphis series, and he may be back. He may not be. Andre Iguodala hasn't played. He might not be back. Mm-hmm. So Boston may be able to survive the thrashing they'll get from the starters as long as they can win those bench minutes, because they have they're leaning on their bench and they could do it. I'm happy for one last thing I want to mention. I'm happy for Al Horford, who is representing the Dominican Republic. He's actually the first player born in Dominican Republic to play in an NBA Finals. He will be. This is his 15th NBA season and his first Finals. So I'm happy for Al Horford. I hope he does well. I hope it's a competitive series. In terms of predictions, my lips are sealed.
You're going to have to just go back and watch all the breakdown that Rob provided if you want to make your own predictions. But it's all there. A lot of great insights. Really broke down both teams, how we ended up here from the playoffs to the NBA Finals. Rob, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I hope you will come back and enlighten us again soon.
I hope to be back too. Thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you, Rob.